Let's take a look at the impact of COVID-19 in South Africa. Qondile Khedama joins me in his capacity as a communications practitioner, social commentator and writer. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. What would you say the impact of COVID-19 has been on our health, our psyches and on South Africa in general?
No, thank you. Is it Ms. Qondile?
It is.
And the viewers. The reality is that the impact of COVID-19 was felt, and it came at the time when the economy of the country was not performing well, and as a result, it put a strain in all governments and throughout the world. But what I look into in my piece is that it was now beginning to erode the leadership or governance or government from the electorates, because what we have seen is that, in fact, the first imbizo that we saw in Northwest showed us that people wanted to interact with the leadership or the people that put them into power, and the issue of proximity was becoming a problem because people were beginning to say, we are not having an access to these leaders, and there are serious implications thereof. And one of the serious implications is that it was beginning to temper the distance between people and government was bordering on the policy. Because remember, if you're not interacting closely as government with your voters, and you are taking certain decisions, including the COVID-19 related decisions, they impact directly on public policy. And this was beginning to really becoming a problem. No thanks. I've seen last week the government has gone back again to people, which is becoming a trend, obviously, and that we must applaud as people that the government is beginning to close that gap. Much as government during the COVID-19 has deployed technology, but the technology is not enough to have the interface with the electorates. So that is why, for me, I am saying in my piece that the COVID-19 was beginning to erode governments from electorates, and what came up as a point that I think all of us should look into is that it was an opportune moment for us to look at how do we do public service. Because if government has been able to react quickly on some of the activities related to COVID-19, why can government look at how they did things, perfect the game, and begin to do the public service? The other thing that you can imagine is that if people were working from home and you are an employee of government, you get injured during working time or so, what does that mean from the human resource policy point of view? It means there is an issue that has to be dealt with, and there's a gap that is supposed to be closed by government.
Khedama, I want to also take a look at the other impact. So you will please excuse me for interrupting your train of thought there. You've spoken to us about how COVID-19 has impacted on relations between people and the government. There was also a lot of, and still is, a lot of misinformation and disinformation around the pandemic. How has that impacted not only that relationship you've spoken about with the state, but media and perceptions of what's correct and what's not?
The issue of disinformation and misinformation was prevalent and common during the COVID-19. And I think one of the things that came up during that time is that the social media became an issue. And I think there were mechanisms that were brought to everybody's attention that how should people start to look into, one, the media itself. Secondly, how is the behavior of those people who participated on social media. What was good, though, is that those credible media houses that have been doing a good work, they were able to be elevated, but equally, we saw a lot of information that seeks to teach the users of social media on how to separate between misinformation, disinformation, and the real information. And this is something that will live with us post COVID-19, because these are the lessons. For example, the dissemination of information, it's one of the key things that we have seen and we have learned a lot from during the COVID-19. And this allows us as the nation to now learn even better. I like that there's a lot of, there's a law that came forth lately on how to manage the information and so, and people must learn from that, because if you are using social media and you can say whatever you want with another person, people are now having a recourse. And that recourse, I think it stems, amongst other things, what we have seen happening during the COVID-19, particularly on dissemination of information.
All right, and then let's go back to the impact of the state and the relationship of the people who live within South Africa. And I'm not just talking about South Africans.
What we have seen is that most people who would, under normal circumstances, come forward physically and interact with the leadership, that opportunity, maybe let me coin it this way, the public participation was heavily tampered with, because if you look at municipalities with the IDPs, where people need to make inputs, and those inputs will live with them for the coming 5 years, and they can only be renewed annually. That process was tampered with because people did not have an opportunity of attending those meetings, being part of your councillors, members of parliament, and so. So this is where we have seen government try to deploy your new technologies. We had new terms like your e-participation. Now, the problem with that is that not all people are able to interact with government in that manner. If the majority or half of the communities or half of the population interact with government through new technologies, you still have those people who believe in traditional ways of interacting with people, and the majority of them are coming from the poorest of the poor. Now, the challenge with government at the moment and post COVID, if it's post-COVID, because it's beginning to erupt in other countries, is that we need to deploy two-pronged approach in terms of communication and participation. We need to use the old ways of engaging with communities, and again, capitalize on the new technologies, because they are there, they've been fast-tracked by the situation, and they must be accelerated.
Mm-hmm. Where to from here? And if we speak a year on from now, what would be the ideal scenario in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and how that's been mitigated by government and also the private sector as well?
Well, for me, what I came across is that what is important for the government of the day, it is to give a feedback. For an example, if you have the Imbizo, people are talking there and all that, what are the turnaround times? Government has to, yes, it has created platforms, and so what is critical for government is to make sure that the turnaround times are adhered to and people are not left in limbo. Mm-hmm. What are those mechanisms that must be brought forward for government to go back quickly and ensure that people get the services that they so want? It will be up to the officials, it will be up to the leadership to come with the metrics of making sure that the turnaround times are brought closer so that people get the services. Because at the end of the day, and at the center of the whole thing, it is people, government interacting with the electorates and ensuring that they get services, and making sure that where there are gaps, the national, the provincial, as we see them making interventions, they speed up that process.
Mm-hmm. Qondile Khedama, communications practitioner and social commentator, joining us there. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening.
You're welcome.